Okay, our last example is a lot more complicated, and it references an SVG file here. But I think once we go through it, you might be able to understand the logic behind the JavaScript and how it's running. It does call for a bit more math. So let's see how this, but it also calls some functions and some methods that are standard to JavaScript that you may or may not find useful to use. So let's go to our Chrome here. And this is the JavaScript that's running. It's recreated a real-time kind of clock face, an analog clock. Okay, let's go see the code. So what I have in my HTML again is a script, and I have a link for a style sheet. And then in the body of my HTML, I have a main. A main is just another, it's a more specific type of section, but it's just this, it's similar to a div. So I have a main section. Then I have my a div within that, and I've set that to a class of clockbox. And then within the div that's called clockbox, I have an SVG. And within this vector graphic, which has an ID of clock, there's a graphic with an ID of face, and this face includes a circle, and then which is called circle, class of circle, and then we have a number of paths, which are, they're vector drawings. And so these paths are called hour marks. They have a class of hour marks, and then here's all the numerical values to make those hour marks appear on our clock face. And then we have the hour hand, the minute hand, and the second hand. And what's included in that is a line, an hour arm, right, which is another path with these points associated. And then we have something that's been given a class of a sizing box, which is the same size as the face of the circle. We have the same thing for minute graphic, which is a minute hand. It's called minute arm. And then we have the second arm. And those both include other circles with the class of sizing box, which is given the same size as the face. And so that's it for the HTML. Now let's look at the CSS here just really quickly. The main section here is given a display of flex, which means that rather than absolute positioning, the positioning will change based on the size of our window. And then we have some padding around it. We have height value, and we have justify content. This might be some way that this might be a parameter or an element that you'd want to set for CSS that will center everything, align items to middle. This is some more positioning kind of elements that you can include. Okay, so then after the main styling, I have here clock box. Both the class clock box and the ID of clock, we want to give a width of 100. So that would be clock box and clock. Both we want to have at 100. So the dividing section and the SVG we're setting to a width of 100. And then we have the clock styles here. So circle, which is that face, right? This is the face of the clock. We don't want to have any fill, and the stroke is black. And then we have the stroke width, and then we have the stroke miter limit, which is another value. Then we have for the middle of the circle. Okay, so that's this little circle here, this little graphic element. We want to fill it with black. It already in the source code here, mid circle, right? It has a different radius than the outer circle. So the inner circle has a different radius. Okay, so that's all that's that element there. We have hour marks, which we want to have no fill and a stroke of black, and again the same sizing. The hour arm has this styling, the minute arm has this styling, and the second arm has this styling. Then at the bottom, we are referencing the IDs for the graphics themselves. So we're saying the hour, the minute, and the second. We want to transform the origin of it to 300 pixels by 300 pixels. So it's bringing it all, and it says here what this is doing. This is making all the arms rotate around the same center point. So we're transforming the origin to the, let's say, the bottom of each of those arms to these positions. And then we want to transition, and we want to transform each of these with half a second ease in and ease out. And so what this will do is when we are running our JavaScript, this will affect the transforms transition, and it's going to ease in and ease out of that transition. So now let's go to the JavaScript and take a look at how we're building that clock. So we have, again, some constant variables. We have hour hand, minute hand, and second hand. And we're using, again, document.query selector, and we're saying find that graphic of hour and put it in the hour hand. Find that graphic minute and put it in minute hand, and find that graphic second and put it in second hand. So the CSS, the only important CSS that, so this is like the important CSS that's also being, that's also helping to run the JavaScript, or the JavaScript and this bit of CSS are all going to help to move that clock around the clock face. So we're just calling for these graphics now, and we're going to be moving and changing the positions of these graphics within our JavaScript. And we're doing that by setting another variable, and that variable we're calling date. And this is a standard method in JavaScript, which is date. And so this is pulling from the browser, from the web browser itself, the date and time stamp that is accessible through the browser. So all browsers have, within their internal programming, a date and the time associated, with the date and the time, just like our computers do. The computers have access to standard date and time. So it's saying pull that date and time and put it in this variable called date. And then we have more variables. These are let variables, so they just have a more limited scope than variables and than this kind of general variable or this constant variable. So it's a little more limited in scope. Aside from that, I can't tell you. You have to look it up what the difference between let and var are. I think it's going to be starting to become kind of minute. But you have this type of variable, and we're going to have an hour. We're going to say that this is called hour, HR. And so we're going to, whatever we pulled, all of that information, all of that numerical date-related information that includes the day, the month, the year, and the time in hours, minutes, and seconds. We're going to run this JavaScript method called getHours from this variable date. We're going to put that in a new variable called hours. We're going to pull getMinutes from the date variable that we've set, and we're going to stick that in a new variable called minutes, and then the same thing for seconds. And then we have here, we just log it out, so we see that it's actually pulling the right data out. And so we have our console log, and we're saying this is just a developer tool here. It doesn't actually do anything for the JavaScript, for the functionality of the JavaScript. It's just a developer problem-solving tool. Okay, then we have more variables underneath that. And so this is the math that's positioning whatever, that's taking whatever the time numerical values are and putting it into the 360 degrees of a circle. So we have another position. We have another variable. We're calling it hour position, and we're setting that equal to this value, this numerical value for the getHours, and dividing it by 12, right? Because there's 12 hours in a clock face. So we're taking that. So we're saying take that hours number and multiply that by 360 degrees of a circle divided by 12 hours. And then we also want to add the information of the minutes. So whatever the minutes value is times 360 divided by 60 divided by 12. So this is going to be a kind of fraction that gets added to the hour hand, right? Because the hour hand will move. It's not just going to jump from one hour mark to the next hour mark. It's going to move incrementally. So this is allowing it to have that kind of incremental movement. And now we have another 1 minute position. It does the same thing. It takes the value of the minute variable, the value that's being taken from the date function that we're pulling that information and storing it in this container, this variable. So the minutes information here, and we're going to divide that. We're going to take that and then we're going to times it by the entire 360 degrees divided by 60 minutes per hour. And then we're going to add the seconds value, and then the seconds value is the seconds times 360 divided by 60 seconds, because remember the clock hands as they're running, right? So this is doing 60 seconds in a full 360 rotation. This is also doing 60 minutes in a full 360 rotation, and then this hour hand is doing 12 hours within a whole 360 rotation. So now we've set all of those variables. Now we have the function called run the clock. And then again, we say it's going to be a function. We name the function. We have the standard ellipses and then the curly brackets. And within the curly brackets is the code that is operating the function, that is operating the clock face when it is called at the very end of the script. So basically, what we have here, and we're setting the hour position to the hour. We're setting in kind of a new hour position. So we're saying, so we have this variable called hour position, and we're going to set it to the hour position plus this little bit of math here, which helps us divide up the graphics, the width and then the size of the graphics in relation to these values. I'm not going to go into more of it than that. This is just more math that sets the rotation, that sets the actual graphic rotational positions based on the width and the height of all of these graphic elements in relation to each other. So we're saying update these values here based on these, not based on these new values. And then for hour hand, which is the constant, which is that graphic hour, we want to transform the style, right? We want style.transform equals, and then we want this transform to be applied. And this is some CSS that you might be familiar with, which is rotate. And then we want to rotate it by, and here we're saying take that numerical value that gets calculated from all of this script and add the unit of DEG for degrees. So we want to rotate it this value, this many degree value. Same thing for the minute hand and same thing for the second hand. So when does this function get run? It gets run at a difference, not being run by the mouse. It's not an event listener that's requiring user input. It's doing it at what's called an interval. So this is another way. It's kind of like setting like the, per frame, like every time that it updates, every time that the browser updates, which is basically kind of frame rate, which is set at 1,000 milliseconds. So every 1,000 milliseconds, run the clock. And the reason so we run the clock because we are pulling the date, and the date continues to be updated. So then these values get updated, these values get updated, and then the positional values are updated. So every second, 1,000 milliseconds, every second, we are getting all of these new numerical values, and so we're running this function at this particular interval, which is another kind of event that we can call. And so that's how we can kind of create this clock-like graphic. So that's it for my kind of overview of the basic syntax, logic, structure of JavaScript. Just to kind of wrap up, we set variables as empty containers, which then we name them whatever we want, and then we fill them with particular values that have that are a particular string of properties that talk to the HTML or talk to the CSS. Well, they talk to the HTML primarily, or they can talk to the CSS too. So these variables that we set, we set variables so that we're able to pull information from the HTML or CSS and put them into our JavaScript. Then we run functions. Functions always have to have the word function, the name of the function, these ellipses, and then these opening and closing curly brackets. And then what happens within that is going to be the function that gets run. And then we have to call that function. We have to call, or it's called a function, or it's called a method. That's the same thing, but anytime you see these ellipses, it designates that this is a method. So it's a bit more code that gets embedded within this particular standardized kind of code word for that longer bit of script. So get hours does something, it takes the value of date, right? So anyway, so that's some of the specifics about JavaScript and how we can think about laying it out. Another thing that I want to talk about is sometimes where your JavaScript is placed within your document becomes important. And so this is something to look into, but let's see. It's not going to give me any clues, but these we have, for this one it's defer, some of the other ones were async. And so this is saying when do we want to run the script, because we have it in the beginning of our so we have it in our HTML, and let's say the browser updates at every fractions of a moment. It's updating constantly, refreshing itself. We don't see it, it's too fast for our eyes, but it's updating at, and so as it's updating, we're running this script, or running the code here, but it's saying, okay, well, when do you want to run this particular bit of code? And so so this value here will help determine when we want to run it. So async, we had that with our event listeners because we wanted to run this code whenever, like, we don't want to synchronize it, I guess, with the running of the HTML. We want to be able to run that script whenever that event listener is called. So anyway, this is something to also kind of be aware of, that you have this extra parameter here, this extra attribute that you could set for your script, which will tell it when you want it to run. That's it for JavaScript. There are the reference pages, the reference pages that I'll link on Canvas that will help you to see, an entire list of all of the event listers. I think the way that you can go about thinking about writing JavaScript, if it's something that after you've watched these videos you feel maybe confident to give it a try, I would maybe suggest kind of Googling exactly what you want to do. So say when the user clicks the mouse, JavaScript, and then it will kind of point you in the right direction. So you might be able to find, and you're absolutely able to like pull code from and kind of appropriate code wherever you find that it can be helpful and put it within your projects. That's fine. You don't have to like write it all out by hand, particularly not, some of the it might be kind of useful to see what other people have done, people who are more experienced coding with JavaScript, what they have done, and see if you can adopt it and make it your own. I'll be having office hours again, and so you will get an email about that, and happy coding.